Hey folks, so I was trying to get this review out for Halloween, but here we are. Still, as an avid fan of the Cthulhu mythos, I figured I'd be doing a disservice if I kept stalling when it came to Cyanide Studios' adventure, Call of Cthulhu. After all, the game promised to bring an experience closer to the sort detailed in the books, and even seemed to bear homage to elements of the TTRPG by Chaosium. So, today I'm going to be diving deep into its guts to see if the call was irresistible, or if the contents of this game was something man was not meant to know. I'm your host Arlyeon. Let's find out together. 1924. After the war, Edward Pierce found himself working for the Wentworth Detective Agency, eking out an existence even as he gradually grew numb from the stream of sordid cases. Nightmares and nightcaps became his constant companions, and his drive to deliver gradually evaporated until both license and livelihood were left on the line. And that's when Stephen Webster arrived with a strange case. Head to Darkwater and investigate the mysterious circumstances surrounding the deaths of his daughter and her family. At a glance, it would seem like an open and shut case, but each new lead draws Pierce further down a rabbit hole years in the making, and from which he's unlikely to emerge unchanged. Summary aside, there's actually a fair amount to unpack here, given that Call of Cthulhu is a narrative-oriented experience, which seems to do its best to provide a slow burn experience befitting the source material that inspired it. For instance, while the game does have a fairly creepy intro, it doesn't relentlessly bludgeon you with obvious attempts at eliciting a reaction. It's not to say there aren't disconcerting discoveries to potentially make, or some truly unnerving sequences as you get further into the game. Only, Call of Cthulhu's energies are more focused on providing you a world to investigate and characters to interact with, drawing you deeper into the stories so that you become invested in the questions it poses, so it can properly screw with you as it reveals its hand. But here's the thing, the game, and by extension Pierce, are not necessarily reliable narrators. See, at the outset of the story, you're made to choose what sort of skills Pierce has. What makes this decision narratively interesting, however, is the fact that these skills don't just open up different dialogue options or feasibly provide the player with different routes in order to advance the story. No, Pierce's expertise, or lack thereof, also serves to dictate just how accurately he can interpret the evidence he comes across, something which can in turn skew the information you're provided with. Sometimes this can be subtle, as he'll come across a bit of information and make a theory about it, and yet you, the player, don't know whether or not he's succeeded at the check. That said, this gets really noticeable when the game has you reconstruct a crime scene and form hypotheses, since it's entirely possible to find yourself ill-suited to actually connecting the dots and coming to a satisfying conclusion at the end. It's actually really interesting to see how these successes and failures, along with your ability to seek out items in Darkwater, help to influence your dialogue options going forward. And yet, it's quite heartening that the game was a fair bit more forgiving than the TTRPG, which partially inspired it. For instance, even if you do decide that you're going to play Pierce as a belligerent, bungling alcoholic, only loosely masquerading as a detective, you'll always be able to progress further into the story. It's just, you may find yourself lacking certain options going forward, and that can actually feel somewhat meaningful by the time the game winds over to its finale. See, the choices you've made, as well as Pierce's mental state, all pave the way towards how this particular story pans out. All in all, there's one default ending and 3 additional ones that can crop up as a result of your choices, such as how much knowledge you've accrued, how sane Pierce is, and even if you've allowed certain characters to die. All of them provide some adequately on-brand denouements to the story, but I'll definitely admit that the one that has you seeing your journey through to its inexorable end held me in thrall. It was just delightfully dark in its details, and given the game made a checkpoint right before your final decision, there's really no reason not to check out every option it provides for you. That said, before you can bask in the bittersweet nectar of victory, you have to get there. So now seems like a good time to actually clarify everything you'll be doing during Call of Cthulhu's gameplay segments. On a broad scope, I've already touched on this a bit, given at its core, I'd call it a dialogue-centric adventure, albeit with some light puzzles, exploration, and stealth. And with a sprinkle of RPG added in there, courtesy of Pierce's skill system. And it's actually the latter system that I really want to start in on, as there's a fair amount to unpack in regards to your skills. For instance, your introduction to it at the start of the game provides you a hefty amount of points to personalize your investigator, after which you'll slowly earn a trickle of points as you progress further into the case. At initial glance, this makes your choices feel meaningful in a few ways, since skills have certain milestone levels needed to make certain dialogue choices or item interactions. Carefully choosing what to invest in can feel monumentally important. Or less so, since, well, remember the thing I mentioned about failing skill checks? This is dictated by a combination of your skill levels and random dice rolls behind the scene. That's right, you can go deep into some skill trees and just persistently screw the pooch on some interactions because RNGesus hates you. Thankfully, there are a number of ways to progress forward, even if some become barred to you, but yeah. Also, I should mention, while you can boost most of your skills when you level, occult and medicine are exceptions. You can only really customize those at character creation, and afterwards by finding text or objects associated with them scattered through the levels. And yet, once I played through the game a second time, I found myself a bit disappointed, because, well, it became a bit more apparent that there were certain skills that were higher value than others. Specifically spot hidden and investigation, which, I mean, yeah, you're a detective, I guess that makes sense, but the fact of the matter is, if you're interested in finding lore items and collectibles, you'll need to dump the crux of your points into these skills, especially because of the skill checks and the way that they can fail you. Oof. Oh, and strength, by the way, while you can use that to brute force a few puzzles, literally, it doesn't actually have any real application beyond that. Even when the game provides you hostile characters, a maxed out strength score doesn't provide you the means of subduing them. You are functionally afforded the same capacity to contend with a foe as someone who never touches the stat, crouching and hiding. That, or desperately running away, and since you have unlimited stamina, it's not a terrible option until you find a hiding spot. Not that there's a lot of stealth segments. Offhandedly, I can remember 3 of them, each which are blessedly short. I mean, there's a late game segment that can devolve into hiding, but it's only if you decide to test how many bullets are in a gun on everything that moves. I forgot that guns need bullets. Didn't help that the gun basically auto-aims, which made it a really tempting option. Really, sometimes you just want everyone dead in an area so you can take in the sights, and Call of Cthulhu is pretty enough to warrant snooping around to take those in. Like, sure, there's definitely a sort of griminess or grotesqueness to some of its locales, but it looks good. Also, I was surprisingly pleased when it decided to start leaning into the uncanny and creepy. There's some genuinely uncomfortable things to see, and it's just a treat. The audio is pretty great too, whether it's the music, the ambient noise in the areas, or just the dialogue. I really enjoy Pierce's voice acting. But yeah, that's my thoughts on the individual elements of the game. What that boils down to and put together, though, well, ultimately I am fond of it. On the narrative front, it's a Cthulhu mythos story that feels like it's doing its best to stay true to the source material. The horror is, like I said, a delicious slow burn, and while some creepy elements do crop up, it's more than happy to give you space and allow tension and mystery to build back up. What's more, for the purists in the audience, Call's treatment of the otherworldly elements left them feeling more like threats to survive and avert rather than anything you can comfortably overcome. Admittedly, there were times when I found myself a bit perplexed, but honestly, even the narrative inconsistencies I came across wound up making sense in a sort of everything is effed kind of way, to the point that I was highly suspicious of everything, including Pierce, by game's end. That said, while the story was gripping, its mechanics were less so. That's not to say I didn't try and do a second playthrough, but I hit a point where even with a different skill allotment, the journey simply didn't feel different enough. The most meaningful change I'd encountered was a strength-related shortcut in an earlier act, but even then, I was mostly going through the same motions as my earlier run. I was still stuck on a mostly linear path, finding similar clues and reaching the same set pieces, with the main differences mostly coming in the form of dialogue or conclusions that Pierce would make about some clues. And gameplay-wise, while the novel segments were alright the first time around, I really wasn't that keen on doing the stealth segments again, since it was going to amount to much the same. After all, I'd seen 3 of the games ending during my first run. It simply didn't feel worthwhile for that final one. Ultimately, I think I was disappointed the game, which took some inspiration from Chaosium's namesake TTRPG, didn't afford me more freedom, and I never got over how beyond that central pair, the rest of my skill choices didn't feel like they had the same amount of impact. All the same, I did enjoy this game enough to think it warrants being called a hit, at least for that initial run. While I don't find myself inclined to return to it, that first blind playthrough was absolutely magical for me and left me with a lot to mull over. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. If you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know the new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and to my Patreon, which can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on Indie Games Live, check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlyeon. That is on a slight bit of hiatus right now because my headset that I own is broken, but it will resume, hopefully soon. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.